Hi, everyone. We're going to get started with the presentation today. Thank you for being here. We're going to keep allowing people to enter as they come into the waiting room. And in the meantime, we'll just get started with the presentation. We have a big agenda for the day. So I'm Liz Young-Winnie. I'm a co-chair of the Healthy Communities Committee for APA Colorado, and Braden Nicholson Hopkins, who's also here, is a co-chair. We're really excited to have some staff from the City of Boulder join us for this presentation today. We're excited to host them, and I'm going to pass it off to them right now. We're going to drop a couple of questions in the chat so folks can start introducing themselves. And if you come up with any questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll monitor that as we go. Thank you.
All right, ready to kick things off, Braden? Can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name's Amy Lewin. I go by Liv. Thank you so much for coming today. I am a senior transportation planner with the City of Boulder and the project manager of the Vision Zero Innovation Program, which is one of the programs we're going to talk about today. And I know one of the questions that we're asking of you and that we'd love to share is our favorite mode of transportation. And I actually love long walks combined with bus trips, and you can get pretty far in our region. So I like to do that with a friend of mine. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Knowles to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan Knowles. I'm also a senior transportation planner at the City of Boulder, and I work in the capital projects division. So work a lot on construction projects and short-term planning projects. And my favorite mode of transportation probably is riding my bike. I really enjoy a good bike ride, especially when I'm going to the office, but just in general.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Liv. Ryan Hanchin here. I serve the people of Boulder, Colorado as an engagement specialist for the past 3 years, working to strengthen democracy and shift the culture of how our city makes decisions. And my favorite mode of transportation, I would have to say bicycles. My shed tells me I have too many bicycles, but ongoing disagreements. So Liv, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ryan and Ryan. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we hope you'll come away with today, really an understanding of our overall approach to community engagement at the City of Boulder, ways to really elevate the voices and hear from underrepresented community members. We're going to talk more specifically also about what we call quick delivery and innovative transportation projects. And specifically within that, we're going to focus on how do you incorporate community feedback when you're making decisions about projects, and what happens when it's controversial or if you're dealing with conflicting viewpoints. So next slide, please. So what that will look like is we'll start off with an introduction to community engagement and equity in Boulder. Then we'll spend a little more time on the transportation specific projects, those innovations we were talking about. We'll have some time to hear from you all. We'd love to get your thoughts. And then we'll wrap everything up at the end, hopefully with some time for questions and answers. Okay. Next slide, please. So just in case you're new to Colorado, Boulder is kind of, you can see that red circle on the left. It's in kind of the north central part of Colorado, northwest of Denver. We have about 108,000 population, and that's set over about 28 square miles. And the city is actually surrounded by 2.5 times that, about 71 miles of open space. So that map on the right kind of gives you the lay of the land. You may have heard of Pearl Street Mall, which is downtown, kind of in the center of that map. and that's just north of University of Colorado's main campus. Today, we're going to talk about some projects in different parts of town. Those numbers are our little case studies that we're going to present. And so some of those are in North Boulder and some of those are in South Boulder as well. And so with that, as we go to the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Hanshin to talk a little more about community engagement and equity.
Sure, thank you, thank you. So I want to start a few years back when community engagement in Boulder was not working so well. And we're continuing to hear from community members 2015, 2016 saying, look, the way the city is doing community engagement is not working. And community members were not clear about the processes for community engagement, did not have faith that there was integrity in the process, and really having no clear idea of where their ideas or their input were headed and how they were influencing different projects. And so City Council pulled together a public participation working group made up of community members, council members, and staff who spent over a year together. I want to say 36 different meetings together to really come with 2 recommendations. And one of those said, look, we really have to shift the culture of community engagement within the city. And we want to make sure that we're bringing some resources to support that shift, right? And so looking at staff positions, looking at building out some trainings and toolkits, but really making sure that we were moving towards a culture of community engagement that was meaningful and inclusive. And a lot of this is captured in the strategic engagement or the engagement strategic framework. Let me drop this in chat here. So there's some context there, but really looks at how can we leverage International Association of Public Participation, IAP2's engagement spectrum, and really looking at building a understanding of community members who understand the process, what level they're sharing input, and closing the loop and sharing, hey, here's what we've heard, here's how we're going to apply that, and what that looks like moving forward. Also wanted to make sure to touch on the city's racial equity plan. And this is newer to the city, was just adopted in February 2021. And while the city's commitment to racial equity work has been going back a number of years, this is the first time that the city has been really clear about, this is our really focused and specific plan for advancing racial equity moving forward. And so I'll also drop this one in chat here so folks can see the whole extent of that plan. But do want to mention kind of a high level some of those goals. The first one is really normalize and operationalize an understanding of institutional and structural racism among people who work for the city, represent the city, right, including all staff, council, boards and commission members. The second is really take action to end racial disparities in city services. The third one here, strengthen partnerships and collaborate with community members and organizations that demonstrate a commitment to ending racism, right? We know that, the city only has so much that we can do that's directly under our control. We need a lot of partners in this work too. The fourth here, really build and maintain trust, expanding the influence of community members of color through inclusive and responsive engagement. And the fifth one here, eliminate barriers and create opportunities to build diverse workforce across the depth and breadth of local government, including local officials, boards, commissions, work groups. And so if we can move on to the next slide, we'll see an example of really where that inclusive engagement of the engagement strategic framework and racial equity plan comes together in our team of community connectors. So this was first piloted three and a half years ago, really as a way to build trust between community members and city government, to really make sure that the city was able to partner with natural community leaders in elevating the voices of underrepresented community members. And so we have a strong team now, maybe 18, 20 different community connectors who are able to serve as that bridge between local communities, neighborhoods, and city government. And there's a number of different kind of short-term, long-term planning and systems-based projects where community members are active as community connectors, and they do receive a stipend for their time and their commitment and their expertise. Yes, Aaron, we do pay a stipend for community connectors. Absolutely, thank you. On to that next one. One example of where the lived experience and the perspective of community connectors has been essential comes to a shared street project that was in the fall of 2020. And the transportation staff had received some funding from CDOT that was really focused on, how can we make sure that, as we're in the middle of this pandemic, as recreation opportunities are a bit limited, how can we be expanding, places where folks are safe and comfortable to ride bikes or rollerblade or ride their scooters, all right? Like they all got favorite modes of transportation too. How can we have more safe spots for that? And really looking at, Boulder Meadows manufactured home community, around 600 homes within this community, and wanting to think about, all right, what would it look like to close down 19th here, you can see in the middle, Violet Avenue to the south here, to really make sure that there's more room for folks to be walking, to be gathering, outside where it's safer and more socially distant. And we've, with the city, moved towards a model where let's look at how we're making these decisions with communities. And transportation staff had a chance to pull together a proposal and met with community connectors to say, hey, here's what we're thinking. We'd love to hear your feedback. As community members who live directly in this neighborhood, we'd love to hear what you're thinking. In any ways that we may want to adjust this. And community connectors who live within Boulder Meadows, specifically part of a Latina community and a poly community, really said, hey, this is a really great plan, but we're not gonna close down Violet, right? Like, many of our neighbors, head west on Violet, and then that's, right, there's an easy light onto Broadway to turn to, head to work, head to school, to drop off the kiddos, to make their commitments. And hearing that feedback, we said, okay, so it sounds like we really want to make sure that Violet remains open. Let's talk about 19th. And community member said, yes, like we think that'd be a really great one to close for. Oh, and I think we can move to the next one here. The next slide, right? One that we can close to through traffic, right? Just really have it for community members who are living there in Boulder Meadows, recognizing that we're going to see school buses coming through, right? Because that's where the school buses are dropping off after school. Recognizing that city buses will continue to come through there, and many folks relied on that for work. But let's make sure that we're able to, both hear the needs of community members for that access, and close it towards its only local traffic to make sure folks have more opportunities to recreate there. So a bit about community connectors and what that has looked like, a bit about our engagement in racial equity. Happy to chime in later if there are questions, but Liv, I think I'm turning it back to you now.
I think it's going to me, actually.
All right, Ryan Knowles, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. So I also wanted to talk about Boulder Meadows in the context of the Neighborhood Speed Management Program. So the NSMP is the City of Boulder's traffic calming program. It's a capital program. We install long-term traffic calming devices on local and collector streets, so neighborhood streets and streets that are connecting neighborhoods to bigger arterials. And things that we install typically are like speed humps, traffic circles, raised crosswalks, chicanes, etc. And so the purpose of the program is really to reduce vehicle speeds and to improve the safety and quality of life in our neighborhoods and create spaces in these neighborhoods that are really shared. So places where people feel comfortable walking, biking, walking a dog, playing. And so we have a process through which residents will petition us for these projects. And the program started in 2017. And since it started, it's been in high demand. So we get a lot of applications every year. We only have a $250,000 budget per year, however, so we're really kind of limited in the number of projects we can do, which is challenging. And so Boulder Meadows was one of the neighborhoods that we heard from, I believe initially in 2018, in regards to concerns about speeding. And, you know, Boulder Meadows, like Ryan Hanchen mentioned, is a very dense place. There's about 600 units in a very tight neighborhood. And so we were hearing these concerns about speeding on these interior streets, the very local neighborhood streets in Boulder Meadows, which are in fact city streets, which is a little bit different than some of the other manufactured home communities we have in the city. And so hearing these concerns and talking to residents, we quickly realized that there was an inherent barrier to entry that was designed in the program. So if you could just go to the next slide. So that barrier to entry and equity concern really is that we ask folks to petition, as I mentioned, in order for us to really start our process where we conduct a speed study and determine, what vehicle speeds are, what traffic volumes are, and then to really work through the process with the community about what the right traffic calming device is and where it will go, et cetera. But that initial step of getting in the door requires people to sign their name and their address to a petition. And so we heard early on that this was a concern from folks in Boulder Meadows. So people felt really uncomfortable sharing their personal information with the government, frankly. And so we went to work thinking about how we could best address this issue. And we actually collaborated with the Boulder Police Department, who had a good working relationship with a lot of folks in the neighborhood, and held a joint public meeting where we developed kind of an anonymous balloting system. So we had a little like ballot box with instructions in English and Spanish, and then we had tickets. So folks could, as they went up to get snacks or on their way out of the meeting, they could just drop a yes or a no, essentially, into the ballot box. And so that worked out quite well. We were able to determine that most of the people who were at that meeting would support traffic calming. And so our petition requirement is generally 20 signatures or one signature from 30% of the households on the block, whichever is less. And so the balloting exercise indicated that we had about 50 people who would support traffic calming in Boulder Meadows, as opposed to, I believe it was 3 or 4 that weren't too excited about it. So for us, that was just enough to get going on our process. And so from there, we really worked closely with the community connectors that Ryan mentioned, and then also we held on-site public meetings, because by the time we got around to developing the traffic calming plans, COVID-19 had occurred. And so we actually held on-site outdoor meetings, fully masked up, where people could come out and review plans. We plotted them out on a big plotter, and just told people we'll be here on these days from this time to this time, and as you are available, just show up and let us know what you think. And that worked out quite well, actually. It was something of a pop-up type meeting, but we were able to get lots of comments. And then we actually also held an online virtual forum where we had interpretation, and then the presentation was bilingual. And so we were able to get additional feedback through that in regard to, where we were placing speed humps, answering questions about how they worked, what the design was. So very similar to our normal meetings that we have in regard to placing traffic calming devices. And ultimately, we were able to move forward with the project. And last summer, late summer, early fall, we were able to install 14 speed humps in the neighborhood, which was by and far more speed humps that we've installed in any other neighborhood in the city. And so really for this neighborhood that historically has not gotten a ton of attention, we were able really to develop a great working relationship with residents and ultimately make a big investment. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so I just wanted to highlight this project also, which is one we finished this previous August. So just building on the relationships that we cultivated with the community connectors and through the NSMP project, and on that 19th Street Shared Street project that Ryan discussed earlier, as kind of a part two to that shared street, we were able to leverage funding that we received from the Colorado Department of Transportation to develop a street mural in the intersection of 19th and Avocado, which is really in the heart of Boulder Meadows. And so, so with all that relationship building that we had done previously, we were able to go back out and hold another community meeting on site where we were asking folks for their input in terms of a design and things they would like to see and what was important to them. And we worked with an artist, Anthony Garcia Sr., who is from Denver, to develop the design you see on the right, really reflecting the Nepali and Latino community within Boulder Meadows. And we invited folks out to actually help us paint it. So this was in mid-August. And it was just really it felt like the culmination of a few years of work, really, to have this great turnout where we had just tons of neighborhood kids and residents helping us paint this mural in the middle of the street. And it just was for myself, on a personal and professional level, it just felt like kind of the high mark of a lot of work that we had been doing over the previous few years. So I just wanted to highlight that. And I believe we'll go to Liv now to talk about the Vision Zero Innovation Program.
Yes. Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, the Vision Zero Innovation Program, which we like to call VZIP for short, and I'll put a link in the chat for you here so you can access that website. This program was really developed to address the challenge that typically transportation projects cost a lot and take a long time, right? So we were charged with trying to figure out, can we do some lower cost, quick delivery projects that will still be effective at making it more comfortable for people to bike and walk, reducing risk, slowing vehicle speeds. And, key to this, because these are kind of new sorts of treatments, is to build in an assessment of effectiveness, right? So we were always planning to do things like collecting traffic data before and after the implementations. We were going to go out and observe behavior and also collect community feedback along the way. So we could consider all of those in determining if we would want to actually use these tools more in the future. So next slide, please. So the next slide just provides a few examples of what these look like and the types of projects we're talking about. They generally use paint and posts. Unlike the speed humps that you saw with the NSMP. These are pretty quick to install and kind of stay at the level of the street with the posts sticking up. So we did things like curb extensions, which can shorten the crossing distance and narrow the roadway and slow vehicle turning speeds. We developed some median islands with paint and posts. Normally these are done with concrete, but this again is another approach to developing that pedestrian refuge for when people are crossing that also narrows the roadway a bit. And another example is a paint and post traffic circle that we actually installed that also uses parking stops to help develop that traffic circle. So just to give you a little flavor of the types of projects that this program was implementing. Next slide, please. And so remember Ryan mentioned there's a high demand for the NSMP, a high demand for traffic calming, for reducing vehicle speeds in the neighborhood. But the budget doesn't quite meet that, doesn't address it. And so working together, we said, well, can we take this VZIP program and implement some traffic calming in the interim so that the folks in these corridors will get some projects in the near term, because otherwise it could be many, many years before they get their permanent project through the NSMP. So it was always an idea that these would be interim traffic calming projects that would then be replaced with something more permanent when the NSMP budget allows. And so from a community engagement standpoint, we of course thought like, wow, this is great. We're going to corridors where the residents have already requested traffic calming. They're going to be on board. It felt like we were giving them a gift, you know, because otherwise they wouldn't get their projects for a long time. So we identified 7 corridors to focus on through VZIP. I'm going to talk about 2 of them today, the Darley corridor and the Quince corridor. And you can see those circled on the map. One is in South Boulder and one is in North Boulder. So next slide, please. So starting with Darley, posted speed, we dropped our default speed limits to 20 miles per hour last year. And so this is one of those corridors with that speed limit, a fairly wide street at 40 feet wide. The ADT, the average daily traffic that we collected was 800 vehicles per day, over half of which were speeding over the speed limit. The 85th percentile speed is a benchmark that we use in traffic engineering. The data that we collected showed that it was 25 miles per hour. And on the NSMP list, it was number 12. So again, it would be a long time before we would be able to implement the permanent project through the NSMP. So next slide, please. So what we did for each of these corridors was we developed some conceptual plans and these designs that you see here. And our intent, our goal was to provide enough information that people would get a sense of what we were proposing, but not to make it overly complicated, like using CAD drawings and things that could be harder to follow. So we developed these corridor designs and posted them on our website with a tool for providing feedback. We also did some neighborhood virtual forums online. Again, this was during COVID, so we were working online here. And we posted about the forums on our webpage. We sent out postcards to people who lived right in these corridors and then also posted in Nextdoor to let people know about these forums. And so by and large, well, we presented these forums. Next slide, please. And in the Darley corridor, we did get a lot of pushback, a lot of concerns, some feedback from the residents. A lot of these were related to the potential parking impacts, concerns about snow and ice removal, as well as this corridor is between several schools, and a lot of kids bike and walk here, like they almost take over the street. And so we really felt like at this point in the process, we needed to consider a revised design based on the feedback that we were hearing. And so what we did was we did update the design, made some changes specifically addressing the feedback we heard. We actually created a separate webpage for Darley as a landing page with this design and more information saying, we heard you and here's our revised design. That was linked to the main VZIP webpage. The Darley webpage also included a specific online questionnaire where we could get feedback on the revised design. And to let people know about this, we sent out another round of postcards. Actually, it was letters, I think, specific emails to our distribution list, as well as a next door posting. So next slide, please. So I'm sure you're wondering what kind of feedback did we get on this revised design? So if we can do the magic click. We got over 50 responses. And what you can probably see right off is very, very split. I say split skis, right? Part of the questionnaire included a very specific question on the level of support using a Likert scale that you can see from strongly support to strongly oppose. And then we also asked people why, so we could understand their specific concerns. So it was highly split in terms of all the people who responded here on both ends of the spectrum. And then we honed in on the people who just lived on Darley, had frontage, front or side yard on Darley. And you can see again, it's also very, very split. And so, you know, as we considered this, we had a decision point. And that decision point was, should we move forward with the installations? So I'm going to leave on the edge of your seat for a moment because you're going to talk about that in a bit. And before that, we are going to talk about that other corridor that I mentioned, the Quince corridor. So this is the corridor in North Boulder, also with a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit, a narrower street. As you can see, it's 28 feet wide and it doesn't have sidewalks. So a little bit of a different character here. It does have higher volumes, actually. You can see 1,700 vehicles per day. And again, well over half of those, many of those are going over the speed limit with the 85th percentile at 27 miles per hour. So it ranked a little higher on the NSMP list, but again, would be several years before getting their permanent project. So the next slide shows you again, what we were proposing to do, several treatments in this corridor. When we presented this at the forums and online back in the summer, we really didn't hear any major negative feedback or concerns. So we moved forward, and the next slide shows you some photos of what these installations actually look like with the paint and post in the roadway. And soon after we installed these, we did start getting some more feedback. Next slide. And you remember I mentioned that part of this project is to collect community feedback along the way. So if you've been to the website now, you will see there's a link to a questionnaire that allows folks to provide feedback on the installation, their experience before, as well as their experience after, and using different modes. So you can fill it out and say, when I bike, this was my experience before, this is my experience after. You could say, when you drive, this is my experience before, this is my experience after. And it's a little quantitative in terms of the level of comfort, but also you can share a little of the why as well. And so what we've been seeing from our feedback on Quince in particular is magic. that when we look at the before and after assessment of comfort for anybody who using this roadway who has responded to the questionnaire, you can see the three main buckets that are colored here. Green would be my comfort has improved, yellow is no change, and red is worsened. Okay, and so what we have found is that the people who've responded, all of them have either said my comfort hasn't changed or it's worsened. Now, I will say that a lot of the worsened folks are the people who are driving, because as you saw from the picture before, there's a lot more to navigate. Some people call it an obstacle course. But again, the intent was traffic calming, right? Reducing the speeds on the roadways where there have been some challenges. And so it's been really interesting to see this feedback, but through the questionnaire. We've also, of course, gotten emails and phone calls, and I was even on site the other day with somebody who likes the installations. So, but she hasn't responded to the questionnaire, right? So there's that question of how do you take the temperature, right, of the community when you have kind of these limited channels. And so again, we have a decision point, which is, do we keep these installations in? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liz to lead our discussions, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on these case studies.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here again. It looks like we do have time for breakout rooms, which is super exciting because we were hoping that we would land here with enough time to be able to do breakout rooms and do the discussions that are listed on your slide that you should be seeing right now. So the first question is, when dealing with conflict and/or negative feedback, what would you need to consider for decision making? And the second is, briefly share about a similar experience. There's a lot of people coming from different states, different departments, different jobs and experiences. And so we wanted to leave it a little bit vague for you all to share your personal experiences in your breakout groups, but with enough information to think about what the staff at City of Boulder has been talking about, and to share with a small group about some of your thoughts. When we come back, if you could each designate one person from your breakout group to just provide like a quick summary in the chat, that would be great. And I think Braden will be putting you all into breakout rooms here shortly. Everyone should be getting a pop-up that says, please join the breakout. Click that button and head on in.
Do we want to pause the recording here so we have a moment to chat behind the scenes? The larger group.
All right, we'll bring it back to the large group. We may have had a couple of people that maybe dropped off of the call during the breakout session. So as people come back, we'll just invite them back to the meeting. If people feel comfortable, drop a quick summary of what you talked about, either in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you. We've got a few minutes to be able to talk a little bit about what was going on in the breakout rooms if you'd like, or like I said, we can put that in the chat and kind of summarize it for you. So go ahead and provide a little bit of information about what you talked about in your breakout, and let us know if you'd like to unmute and speak that instead.
Can you hear me? This is Bonnie. I was in group 2, and we did discuss some of the challenges. One was that police were often dissuaded about putting anything that slowed traffic. And I mentioned that in Tempe, we typically will bring, if we're putting something out in the street, we'll generally bring our firemen out with a truck prior to really installing anything for good, just to be sure that they're on board. And someone in our chat mentioned that they actually had people running into the sticks when they tried to create a pedestrian sidewalk because they were against that treatment, which is a little scary. So I don't remember who that was. She may be able to speak to that. And then finally, I just mentioned that we have a pretty extensive street calming project about to go into construction. And in an area of single family homes, we had a lot of controversy about whether we could take part of the street and plant some trees amongst the parking to help slow traffic. And it really just took extensive door-to-door speaking with people, a living room meeting with local neighbors arranged, and working with 4 neighborhood groups to be able to come to agreement on what we could do. And it ended up being successful and plan. I'll let you know next year if it's successful in execution.
Thanks so much, Bonnie.
Uh-huh.
Do we have any other folks from the breakout rooms that want to share a quick summary of your conversations? Feel free to drop that into the chat or unmute yourself. We'll take just a couple more minutes if anybody's got anything that they want to chat about.
Liz, the one thing I would add when thinking about what information is needed for decision making is, I think it's really helpful. We've seen in Longmont, it's helpful for elected officials to have data because I think sometimes these can be pretty emotional decisions for residents. And I think obviously in Boulder, you mentioned there was split feedback. But I think for us, it's important for our council to understand, what would a speed reduction really result in terms of delays? What could reduce speed really do in terms of severity of crashes? How will this kind of affect the overall system? So I think it's really important for people to have the data in their back pocket. I don't know that people always want to hear that. But I think if there's questions that are asked, the decision makers being able to have the data and being able to point to that to say, hey, we've evaluated it from these perspectives and here's what we know, I think is pretty important for folks to have.
Thanks so much for sharing that insight, Erin. We can maybe take time for one more group if you want to share out a quick summary from your breakout or any insights that you found productive related to the questions from the breakout, or again, feel free to use the chat.
I can share. This is Samuel Jensen. I'm from Huerfano County. In our group, we talked about the need to balance sort of safety, and it looks like Eileen's kind of posting what we talked about here, but safety trade-offs versus people's convenience, needing to figure out a way to take safety seriously and really look at that and not just go with immediate comments of the people who are right there on that street who maybe aren't being affected in a safety way. And then we also talked about the need for political willpower too, that if something's been approved by the city, maybe not in terms of quick build projects like this, but in terms of larger bike ped plans, if something's been approved by the voters or it's been a city council priority and there are reasons behind it, it's been studied, sometimes that needs to be taken seriously too and not shot down by a sort of NIMBYism in a very local context.
Thank you, Samuel, for sharing, and Eileen too, for sharing what you all talked about in your breakout rooms. We really appreciate it. It's helpful to hear a little bit. As we know, it's nice to share. So thanks for sharing. And I'll kick it back over to the City of Boulder staff, and we'll continue on with the presentation, and they'll let you know what they did.
That's right. Thanks so much, Liz. And thanks to all of you for your great thoughts. I did just want to touch on the emergency vehicle thing. That's a great point, Bonnie. We did work with fire and made sure that our designs would work for them, and also let them know that if there was something that they found wasn't working, we would be able to tweak the installations. So that's a great point. We also worked with our maintenance staff regarding snow plowing, which may or may not be relevant for you depending upon where you live, but is a big deal for us too. So thanks for highlighting that coordination needed for these designs. So just as a reminder of kind of the key decision points, for Darley, the question was, do we want to move forward with the installations given what we knew at the time? And for Quince, it was, do we keep the installations in? So I'm sure you're on the edges of your seats wondering what happened. So one of the things we did is we went back to the core of the program. And as I mentioned at the beginning, as you all have alluded to as well, to understand the effectiveness of these installations, we really wanted to look at a variety of things. We wanted to collect the traffic data. We wanted to observe behavior, how people were actually using it, and then of course, collect that community feedback. And so for our decisions on Darley, I feel like I should be doing a drum roll, maybe. Can you hear that drum roll a little bit? We decided to not implement the projects. When we looked at the data, we didn't see as much of an issue in this corridor compared to others. It was a lower volume and speeding wasn't as prevalent. When we observed how folks were currently using the corridor, and in particular, looking at morning on the way to school, we found that the kids were biking in the street and that motorists were generally yielding or safely going around them. So it just didn't feel as compelling. And knowing that it was so divisive, certainly weighed into that when we kind of combined that with our other observations and the data that we had at the time. So for Quince, another drum roll, boop, 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 boop. We are keeping the installations and continuing to monitor. We have some initial after data with speeds and volumes. And so far, I think we're seeing a slight reduction in speeds. We do have a meeting actually this afternoon to talk in general about the whole program and our evaluation. But when we also went out to Quince, it felt like people were navigating okay through the installations, and we will continue to monitor and continue to get feedback from folks as well, no doubt. So that's kind of a wrap up of our case studies. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ryan Knowles to provide some of our takeaways, lessons learned.
Thanks, Liv. So yeah, we did have a few takeaways from these projects that we've discussed today. And I think overall, one of the things that we've learned is that it's okay, and we, I think, knew this to a certain degree going in, but I think especially the Darley project that Liv discussed has really brought this home. It's okay not to implement a project. I mean, we spend a lot of time developing these projects, and so I think as staff, we tend to get invested in their success. But I think we also need to be cognizant of what success means. And so for Darley in particular, but also to a certain degree with Quince, what we're learning is that a successful engagement process doesn't always mean that the project you designed gets implemented. Perhaps you modify it, or you take a step back from it and come back to the community to try to meet those goals in another way. And so I think the process overall worked as we intended it to work, even though, through the process and when you're in the thick of it, you often hear from folks that, we're doing things that they don't like or do like. It's really important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. And then with that, robust engagement always has challenges. So, these projects are on neighborhood streets and can become very emotionally charged, as one of you, I believe, said in the report back from the breakout rooms. And so that's certainly the case for these projects. People get really passionate about what's happening on their street in front of their house, and that makes 100% sense. And so, it can be challenging to be on the receiving end of that sometimes, but it's also important for us to really talk about, why we're doing what we're doing and how things are supposed to work, to really have that education piece when we're implementing things that are new and are changes to existing conditions. The feedback that we received through these projects really helped us see how we could improve our longstanding programs and the ways that we approach things. Sometimes we I think get stuck in our way of doing things, and especially for these projects where we were trying to address a desire to resolve an issue like speeding, which, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have a long list of projects and a backlog to do those projects. And so we often will, kind of default on that demand as, well, we can't do anything right now because you're on this list and we don't have funding for this list right now. And, we'll give you some yard signs, which is really, from a staff perspective, not a great thing to relate to people who are really worried about an issue on their street. And so I think the feedback we received through the Vision Zero innovation program has really helped us identify where we can streamline project delivery and perhaps do things quicker. And so we're working through those types of improvements now. And then I think lastly, it's also important to balance professional judgment with what we hear from the community through the engagement process. So certainly, as Liv demonstrated, we had, even splits on projects. And so I want to make sure that, what we're saying today is like, we're not asking for the community to give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and then that's how we make a decision. We are trying to balance that with our own professional judgment, as well as other considerations. And so, one of those considerations was a political one. I think when you have these types of programs, it's really important to weigh the benefit of installing a project, perhaps against significant opposition, with the overall goal of the program. And so, these are neighborhood decisions in most cases, where we're doing things to neighborhood streets in response to neighborhood concerns. And so we didn't want these projects to get blown out of proportion and become philosophical city government type issues where, it appeared like, for example, the transportation department is making it harder to drive. And that's what we're about. We're really trying to improve neighborhood streets on a case-by-case basis based on what we're hearing from residents, and in coordination with our long-term transportation master plan and our vision for what the transportation system in Boulder should be, but that's all based on a plan that's gone through public process and been approved and accepted by our city council. And so really we are trying to focus on addressing resident concerns and working hand in glove with residents to make sure that we arrive at projects that meet the goals and concerns that the residents have. And certainly, not everyone is going to be happy, but we're never really trying to install something against the wishes of the majority of the neighborhood. And with that, next slide, please. We're happy to take any questions that you may have. I know we've been answering some as they come in, but I think we can have kind of a more discussion-based session for the balance of our time. So please, Liz, do you want to do that by hand raising or put them in the chat, or?
Either works. If you want to hand raise and we'll work to unmute you, or drop questions in the chat, we can help monitor that too. So however works best for folks, we'd love to hear your questions and have you participate in our last little bit of time together.
I guess I have one question maybe for Ryan. Or maybe for any of you. You said, it's okay to not do a project. And I think that's an interesting perspective. I guess my question would be, how do you sort of, defend might be too strong of a word, but kind of defend that decision when you've spent money on, engineering and installation, and how do you sort of package that? Or is that something that you would only do for like these more temporary projects? Or can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I would say for the temporary projects, I mean, we just kind of have built that expectation into the process for those. And we did spend money on some consultant support for the projects that Liv highlighted. For many of the neighborhood speed management program projects, we tend to do those in-house, but obviously there's a staff cost to that as well. But I would say, it's hard to really know if we can proceed with a project until we've had our engagement process, and part of that engagement process is presenting alternatives and weighing the cost benefit of those alternatives with residents. And so unfortunately sometimes we do end up spending money on projects that don't move forward, but I think that's just part of the process. And unfortunately that's if there's a better way to do it, I don't know. Liv, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And at least one resident who was particularly vocal, brought that up, that, he felt like it was a waste of money that we went through this. But at the same time, as Ryan was alluding to, like, it felt like the right process to do. And based on, some of it is also kind of that gut check, that taking that temperature, it just didn't feel like we had the momentum and I almost want to say like the compelling need. If there had been a crash history or something that we knew we needed to address, we might have made a different decision. But this was a little more on the proactive side. And then I also think that because the corridor is still in line to receive permanent improvements, permanent projects through the NSMP, it felt like it was okay to go, okay, well, we offered them an option to have something in the meantime, didn't feel like it was the right fit for this corridor based on our engagement. And there'll be additional engagement through the NSMP when the budget allows to determine what that will look like. And that will be a new conversation.
Yeah, I guess, and Liv, that I just piggyback on that. I think you brought up a really good point for me. So I guess these projects are a little bit different than, like a TIP funded project or a project that got highway safety improvement program funds for, where, we've identified like a very specific like safety issue tied to a crash history or crash trend. And we've gone out and secured federal or state funding to address that issue. And even in those processes, we still go through an alternatives analysis with the community. And, we end up probably relying more on our professional judgment in those types of projects than we do on the engagement side of things, because they are, tied to those issues. But we still do engagement, and we still discuss like the considerations for design elements in those projects. I think that the major difference with these traffic calming projects and these interim paint and post projects is that we aren't necessarily responding to a safety problem in the sense that we have a crash trend or a documented history of that nature. We're more responding on a proactive level to the quality of life concerns that residents have and the potential for a serious injury crash to occur based on the speeding that we observe, if that makes sense. So really it is a nuance, but an important one, because I think to your question about, had we gone through the process and then not done the project, how would we defend that? It would be a lot harder to defend that if we had received federal or state funding and then gotten to the end of the process and said we weren't going to do the project. We'd have to have a really good reason not to do it, because we have that external funding and the expectation of the state DOT and the Federal Highway Administration that we are making an improvement.
Thanks for those responses. We've got a couple of questions here for Ryan Hanchin. The first is, if you could talk a little bit more just about the Community Connector program, maybe provide a little bit of insight to folks who are interested in starting that, with how it started getting rolled out at the City of Boulder. We have a very specific question here, which is, what are some of the most creative ways that you have reached out to residents? And could you talk a little bit about creative community engagement tactics? Thanks.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. We first launched a pilot of Community Connectors program, I was 2018, maybe spring of 2018. And really built on lessons learned working with partners and hand in hand with community members to really build something that would work for the community as well. We really started with shorter term projects and had a number of different shorter term projects that may have been focused around support and completing a questionnaire with specific parts of our community, and has really grown. And we've seen a lot more with long-term planning. So at the moment we have Community Connectors, at least one or two that are serving with 4 master planning processes, from East Boulder sub-community planning to reimagining policing, to Parks and Rec, and comprehensive flood and stormwater master plan updates. And then they've also been really instrumental in addressing COVID and really recognizing a need for accurate and quickly updated COVID information to be reaching vulnerable communities. We put together a team in March 2020 to really make sure that accurate information was getting out and making it more accessible for community members, right? And you'll remember, right, at that time, there's information coming from the county and the city and the state and the feds, and right, to really work to make sure to package those up into little nuggets and saying, look, this is the most important thing for you and your family to know. Here are the basic needs resources that'll support you the most in this time. And I think one of the things key, to all of our community connectors work, has been that two-way dialogue, right? Let's make sure that we're, seeking input for projects, but also making sure that we're, hearing from community members, what are the issues, what are the concerns, what are the bright spots or assets that are within their communities as well. Around creative, I think, I think community connectors are one piece of that, and I think, they've been really instrumental in co-designing what that community engagement looks like in the first place. And so, their expertise in knowing what's going to be culturally relevant for my neighbors, my network, my community, has been a lot more effective. And looking at, all right, is this something that we can share over WhatsApp and that works there? Is this something that's over a Facebook group? Is this thinking about different ways that can be shared and the word can be getting out there, and including more community members.
I can also add something. It's an example that was pre-COVID, but might still be relevant. For our transportation master plan, one of the things we did was create a large kind of vinyl map of Boulder. And we brought it out to, you always hear about like, go to where people already are. So we brought it like to our rec center, maybe even I think to the farmer's market. And we were asking questions. In this case, it was, where do you like to walk or bike and why? And people could kind of like annotate that on the map. And so it was very active. It was really fun with kids too. And it really, like, people noticed it. And I feel like we were able to reach some folks who maybe wouldn't always be paying attention to our websites or getting emails, but we went to where they were already. So that was really fun. Just wanted to share that in case it sparks something for you all.
Thanks for sharing. Ryan, there's a question about how the funding is set up long-term for the community connectors. Braden and I are familiar with similar programs in public health, but I think it's a little bit unique to have a city and not a county health department or a similar organization like a nonprofit lead this work. So it would be really great to hear how the City of Boulder plans to continue to fund this really interesting and popular group for long-term. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Our initial pilot was funded externally, was funded from Boulder Philanthropies, and then there was a specific community engagement funding that was put towards the program. We have moved to where departments partnering with community connectors are providing the funding for their stipends. And our communication and engagement team is able to really support and make sure that community connectors get up off the ground, especially when there's more technical expertise that's needed, and there's some context and some definitions, and I mean, like, you transportation, what I'm talking about, like with chicanes and right, there's all kinds of like new things to get up to speed on. And we've continued to have some internal funding come in as well, and it's something that our engagement team has committed funds to, and saying this is something that really embodies the inclusive engagement approach that we've committed to, and we want to make sure that we're supporting that with funding as well.
Thank you. It looks like we may have time for maybe one long question or maybe two short questions. If anybody has any other questions for the group in the City of Boulder, we'd be happy to take those now. And if not, perhaps we can earn 5 minutes back into our day.
I am just interested in finding out any way to be able to do some of this creative painting in the right of way. Because in Tempe, we've just continued to have pushback about it being a liability, perhaps, that it's distracting for drivers. And so if anyone on this call has any good ideas about how we respond to that, I think there've been some real creative projects throughout the states. So a lot of people are doing them. I'd like to be able to come up with some data about it being safe so that I could implement that here.
I'd say for the crosswalks, one thing that, we discuss that a lot with our engineers, and we follow guidance, I believe, from the Federal Highway Administration. And I know Denver follows this approach as well. But for the crosswalks, we'll only paint crosswalks that are stop controlled, because the notion is that driver awareness will be more focused on the stop control than it will be the crosswalk. And so our engineers, our city engineers, feel comfortable with us, doing the crosswalk or between the continental bars or between the crosswalk stripes. Those elements still have to be there. But for crosswalks that are not stop controlled, we don't do any type of artistic treatment with those. For the intersection projects, traditionally those have been focused on lower volume streets. Although the one that we highlighted in this presentation is at a collector. Probably I don't know the volume off the top of my head. It's not a very high volume collector, but it is a collector. So I would just say, I think if you're focusing on lower volume streets, that may have an effect. But certainly, if an engineer feels like something in the middle of the intersection is going to be distracting to drivers, we can certainly connect them with our engineers if they want to have a discussion about it. But that's kind of a hard thing to maybe disprove until you actually do it.
And I would just add, Bonnie, that I agree with everything that Ryan just shared. And another thing to consider is the type of paint that you use, as well as your approach to maintenance. And you want to make sure like the paint is appropriate for asphalt, that it won't get too slippery, particularly if you're using it in a crosswalk. And then another thing that we consider just more in terms of maintenance and aesthetics is if it's on a higher volume roadway, then we actually will adjust the art so that we're not painting in the anticipated wheel paths, because that's going to just wear off so quickly. And we already have the sun and everything else that's, working to wear this off. So we're also kind of considering that in the design, if it's a higher volume roadway, so that it will hopefully stay as fresh as possible for as long as possible. So, and yeah, we're happy to connect you with other staff too, if you have more specific questions or anything.
Great. Thank you all so much. We just have a couple minutes left, so I think we'll wrap it up here. Please take down the information about the CMs. If you're AICP certified planner, you can receive 1.5 CMs for this. We'll send out a follow-up email with the recording in case you want to check back on the questions or share it with other colleagues. And we'll provide the folks from Boulder's email as well. So then you can get in touch with them if you've got some more specific questions. And thank you all so much for being here today. And thank you to Ryan, and Liv for being willing to do this presentation for our committee. You guys spent a lot of time putting this together and making it really great for our audience today. So thank you. And thanks to everyone else who joined us from around the nation for this presentation. and have a lovely rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.